before we go on, and taking as a point of departure some of Annalisa's comments, she's in the position of helping to create and to implement policies, government policies. So that's a really a big concern, and it's something we will focus on in the next section more closely. But today I just wanted to go back a little bit to theories and concepts behind our thinking about development and policies. And so when we talk about policy, we're thinking of governments, and the question is, what is a government? How do decisions get made? And there are a lot of different ways of theorizing about that. If we were in a political science class, we might talk about theories of the state. And questions like, is the government a neutral moderator of discussion? Or is the state a mirror of society in that it has different interests inside it? And those are really two very different ways of thinking about government and policy. One being that there is a bureaucratic, rational procedure, and the other that I would tend to argue for that is more focused on the ways different interest groups influence policy. And they're inside the government. Whether they're, so it's not a separate entity, it's permeated by different interests. And so we've already been talking about those interests when we talked about Annalisa's work. Who are the allies? Who are the enemies? Those are the interests she has to contend with. And sometimes when you read policy-oriented articles, that sort of disappears. It appears to be the seamless, rational process. But we need to remember that those interests are always there, and they're very complicated. They're very complex, and they happen at different levels. She mentioned national, regional, state, local, and they also are always changing. So it's very complex. It's not a straightforward question. And so I'm going to go back to talking kind of from a political ecology perspective. If you recall this idea of having levels and thinking about different factors as they interact. And I'm going to try to take that perspective to go through kind of an overview of development history in the Amazon, in Brazil specifically, to give us sort of a point of departure. So I'm going to hand out a little summary sheet, which this is not really a summary of what I'm going to say, but there are 2 pages of this, so there's a part 1 and part 2. And it's just an attempt on my part to lay out the different levels . It's all right. So as you can see, it starts with the colonial period. Of course, there's the whole pre-Columbian period that we've heard about already that is not even on here, and which did leave its marks on the landscape. So really, we should be beginning thinking about history maybe millions of years ago, thinking about biodiversity and how that changes the landscape for people, and then how people change that landscape themselves. I'm very interested in history because my experience has shown that what happens in a place affects what happens later. And if we only look at what's happening on the ground at the moment, we may miss really what's driving those changes. And so I'm going to go through kind of a lecture on the history of Amazon development policy and try to look at some of the key factors and players at different moments. And this will sort of set up the lecture after the break by Dr. Cynthia Simmons, who's going to address these issues. And many of you commented on her emphasis. So what kind of theories would you say she's using, she and her collaborators, in the articles you read? Were you able to notice what kind of theories they were using?
Marxist.
I would say at least inspired by Marxist theory. Why did you say that?
Because the three articles see the occupation of capitalism in the region of the Amazon as the responsible for the deforestation and the changes, environmental changes in the region.
Right. So Marx's main work was a critique of capitalism as a system that had certain dynamics, and those are some of the same things that they're talking about in those articles. So it may not be a Marxist theory per se, but they're inspired by that kind of outlook. And Vanessa also mentioned neoliberal policies, and that's another way of talking about a period when there was a return to more free reign for capitalism. That's sort of what neoliberalism was all about. And so that's the focus of their perspective, and as Seth mentioned, the key role of money in politics. So these are things that are not just Amazon. These are theories and ways of looking at change in the world that are applicable in most places in the world. And in the article, also the more recent one, they talk about the tension between the idea in land change science of deforesters as rational actors versus this idea of people pursuing their own interests through land grabs and land creation, and these conflicts between what they call camponeses and takers, different players who are competing for the same resources and running into each other. So as Pamela summed it up in her comment, deforestation is actually a vast and complex network of large-scale drivers with great economic power. So we think of deforestation as cutting down trees, right? No, actually it's much more than that, because it's embedded in these really complicated systems that operate at different levels. So that was a nice summary. And in their other article, you see that indigenous people have been kind of violently pushed aside in order for people to gain that access to that land. And this is something that's not actually new in Brazil. Christine had commented that it seemed to be new. It's not. It's been part of the colonial heritage in Brazil as well as in the US. And in fact, the Tocantins, who was it who was asking about Tocantins? Vanessa? No? Who's working in Tocantins?
It's me.
It was you, it was Christine. But if you look at the map in their paper, you will see that Tocantins, the top of Tocantins is an area called the Bico do Papagaio, the Parrot's Beak, is right in the middle of this conflicted area that Dr. Simmons was talking about and where I've worked. So it was very much a part of that same story before and only later became a state. So this is where the indigenous people have become kind of the last barrier to expansion of capitalist interests. And that's why they're on the front lines. And that's why we have conservation as resistance. So trying to hold on to pieces of land that wouldn't be converted to agribusiness. So that's sort of a really big problematic that Dr. Simmons and her collaborators have laid out, and she's going to talk about this afternoon. What I want to do is go through some of these periods and just sort of talk about some of the key things that happened. And I'm hoping that those of you who are familiar with other places like Peru will chime in when there are nuances or factors that were different, or any comments that any of you might have along the way. But so we have in the colonial period this introduction of diseases was the main factor that led to what Heckenberger referred to as the death hypothesis, that there was a huge, perhaps 90% drop in population or during the period after colonization due to the spread of diseases to which indigenous people had no resistance. So even more so than direct violence, this was the most important factor. Diseases like measles killed off whole tribes. And also, you had then a period in Brazil when the Jesuit missionaries and other missionaries in other countries as well were given the authority to deal with indigenous groups, which are now much more reduced. And so in Brazil, what they did was gather them together in villages. So they might be many different tribes, now with smaller numbers living together, and they actually invented a common language called língua geral, general language, so that they could communicate. So this could be seen as kind of a detribalization of people, taking away their specific ethnic identity and creating a kind of generic indigenous. And then following the Jesuits in the Amazon in Brazil, this Marquis de Pombal was put in charge of modernizing the Amazon in Belém, in Pará, and took the power away from the missionaries and used his own power to give rights to Indian labor to merchants and farmers, landowners. And after that, there was a period when basically people ran away. So a lot of whoever could leave those villages that had been formed dispersed along the rivers, and that sort of became the foundation for the next period when you have these river dwellers, ribeirinhos, who are descended from indigenous people, maybe mixed at this point, and become sort of another kind of traditional population over time. And then the big impact came with the rubber boom. So this is now an international impact. So this is already in 1870, global markets penetrating into the Amazon, making huge impacts. Why? Because because industry needed rubber for, what do you think they needed rubber for? Tires. First bicycles, then automobiles. The only rubber at that time was natural rubber from the Amazon. And so this created this huge migration of people from other parts of Brazil into the Amazon. They were induced, they were shipped in there, they were spread out and given areas to tap rubber in. This is also a period of kind of incorporation of national borders. So Acre in Brazil was part of Bolivia at this time, but there was a war that was fought over that piece of land. And that war involved the Bolivian Syndicate, which was actually a US organization of merchants. So you already had in this early period direct involvement of international players in some of the most remote areas. So we think of the rubber tappers now as the traditional people, but this is already a long evolution. Okay. So anyway, you have these at the international level, we had this demand for rubber. It also coincided, though, in Brazil of a period of nation building and interregional migration. So from the northeast of Brazil, primarily, where there was a drought, people rooted into the Amazon, and a disruption of the local populations who were already there. So there were a lot of conflicts between rubber tappers and indigenous people during this period. So the rubber boom lasted actually not that long, and it ended because rubber was planted in Malaysia and did very well in plantations without a disease called leaf blight, which was endemic in the Amazon. And in the Amazon, they had to leave trees planted dispersed in the forest so that they wouldn't pass that disease one to the other. When they put them together in plantations, they got wiped out by the leaf blight. And so it was much less efficient than those plantations where they're all planted together. After the rubber boom, which was sudden, a lot of people left the region, but a lot of them stayed. And they became the foundation then for these later kind of peasantries or peoples of the Amazon. But during the 30s and 40s in Brazil, there was a big push for modernization for the nation state. This was a period when the colonial landowners were being displaced to some degree by industrialists and a more urban elite. And so in the Amazon, there were demands for new products like jute that people planted and the várzea, Brazil nuts and fruits, and it began to be a more diversified economy during this period. During World War II, there was a mini rubber boom because, I think we talked about this earlier, because the Germans blockaded Malaysia. The Malaysian rubber was blockaded. And so the US invested actually a lot of resources. This is the period when Charles Wagley went to the Amazon and formed the public health system so that the rubber tappers could be a new way recruited in to tap rubber. And they were literally recruited as soldiers. They had uniforms. This was their military service. So mind you, this is another wave of migrants now in the 40s. People maybe more urban, maybe with more experience of things like labor unions, different from the people who had migrated during the late 19th century. And there were also new changes from the government, new credit lines, new creation of new municipalities, so dividing up these huge areas, and each one of them would get some resources that could be used to build schools and health posts and to create a little local economy. Mining had some, began, the gold mining in Tapajós began during this period, and some other important places, and also very important, the construction of the Belém-Brasília highway. So this went right up the middle. Right, so here we have, right up here, there was no road here before. So the Belém-Brasília in the, I think, 1966, or around that period, really opened up the region to migration and commodity transport, etc. So this is part of a longer history in Brazil of a moving agricultural frontier. And there's some authors who have written about these frontiers in the post-World War II through the 1960s in southern Brazil, Paraná. And this typically involved loggers I'm going to post this so you don't have to actually try to take notes. Loggers who logged out a lot of the pines in Paraná and then moved on to Mato Grosso, which was the next frontier, the 50s and 60s, opened up by the Belém-Brasília highway. And then after that, in the Amazon, and I put 60s to the present, I think it was Elineide who commented that the frontier is still alive. So this is still, the dynamic is pushing into new areas, new, more remote areas of the Amazon. And then when the military took over, a new phase began. And this is a period when there were a lot of military governments in Latin America. So there we have a bureaucratic authoritarian state. What does that mean? It means it was a sort of authoritarian military-run government with a veneer of technical bureaucratic modernism. And they were able to suppress any kind of criticism and create policies that would lead to what's known as the economic miracle in Brazil during this period, when there's a lot of rapid economic growth, but it led to great income inequalities. And in the Amazon was a big target of this because it was this big empty area, region. Not only were the indigenous people and the ribereños invisible, but the government also was interested in undermining the control that the regional elites held. These were the people who held those Brazil nut concessions that you read about. Big areas of land that they had gotten as part of the sort of colonial land grant system, and that weren't being productively used. They were just being held and used for Brazil nut collection, and it looked very unproductive to the modern eye. Trees were not seen as valuable, and the natives were sort of seen as lazy, unproductive people because they were just hanging out in the forest, collecting things. And so this was the slogan was to inundate the Amazon forest with civilization during this period. And there were a lot of very specific policies to do that favored corporations. So a lot of corporations based in southern Brazil were able to take advantage of tax incentives and move up into the Amazon, buy big areas of land. And a lot of it was speculative. They weren't necessarily very productive. So this was accomplished by the creation of a whole series of government institutions in this period. SUDAM, the Superintendency for Development of the Amazon, sort of the big management entity for the region that, as I said, was enticing corporations to come up to the north and to reinvest their taxable income tax-free in the Amazon. They created FUNAI during this period, the National Indian Foundation, and there was, during this period, the notion was that those Indians would over time be emancipated from their status as indigenous people and become full-fledged citizens. They were literally defined as minors under the law. And Mike Heckenberger mentioned that policy. The idea is that they would assimilate, become, poor urban dwellers or whatever. So this was this linear view, right, of development. You had the undeveloped natives. They didn't know anything about producing. They would learn how to be a worker, and they would become part of this development trajectory. They also created INCRA, the National Colonization and Agrarian Reform Institute. And then what they did there was to try to open up the spaces in the Amazon to small farmer colonists. So if there were areas of Brazil that were overpopulated, this was an outlet, an escape valve for the tensions around agrarian reform in those settled areas. They could simply move everybody into the open spaces of the Amazon, which they did by drawing maps. Drawing lines on maps that would represent highways that were going to be built, and along whose borders they would create colonization programs, and they would settle migrants from other parts of Brazil, like homesteaders. So that was the national integration policy, which created the Trans-Amazon Highway in this period, and the big Trans-Amazon Highway colonization programs along it. There was also a big battle for land and mineral rights. A battle to create the bureaucratic means of allocating rights to land and minerals in the federal government. And you read about the guerrilla war that happened during this period in the Amazon. When I first went to do research in the Amazon, it was only about 2 years after that war, and we found out about it by interviewing people in these small towns who kept talking about the war. We didn't know what war they were talking about. But that was a short-lived. So after the military government lost power, and that was a gradual process, all of the critiques and resistance movements that had been forming as much as possible during the period of the military, it was illegal to congregate. You couldn't have meetings. And so a lot of this organizing took place under the protection of the Catholic Church. And this was a period when the Catholic Church in Latin America had ideology of liberation of theology. So a commitment to the poor, and a lot of the priests and nuns who went to the Amazon region were there to be champions for the poor. And so people were allowed to go to church and be together, and so they were able to organize through these Christian-based communities and other kinds of meeting spaces that the Catholic Church was able to provide. It was protected that they were able to do that. After the military decline and with the beginning of democracy, then all these things just came out of the woodwork. These resistance movements, new political parties, and Berta Becker is a geographer, a Brazilian geographer, who's one of my idols. She's written a whole bunch of books. They're all in Portuguese. She passed away a few years ago. But she talks about this period as the end of the techno-industrial vector, that this whole modernization paradigm had run its course. And in its place came, through this gradual political liberalization, these criticisms and critiques of the way development was being carried out, and these social resistance movements. So we're going to hear in a few weeks about the rubber tappers. They were one of the most visible social movements during this period, but there were a lot of others. This is when indigenous people began to organize. This is when there were groups organizing against the Tucuruí Dam, which was one of the first big dams in the Amazon. And a lot of these resistance movements were able to flourish during this period. And they connected, just like the rubber tappers did, with allies. Those NGOs, those university people, the environmentalists began to work together. There's some very interesting cases of this with the rubber tappers. who connected with Stephen Schwartzman, an anthropologist at the Environmental Defense Fund. They started lobbying the World Bank to lobby against highways or for protection programs to go along with highways that were being built to try to protect the environment and local people. So there was all of a sudden a more concentrated set of alliances across different levels, local, regional, state, national, and even international, in favor of this kind of socio-environmentalism. So this was a new concept that originated in Brazil, putting environmentalism together with social resistance in favor of local people, something that we understand today is a big big movement and a big important shift in our way of thinking began in this period. People hadn't put all that together yet. So the military responded with trying to have their own sort of populism, but it didn't work very well. This is something we talk about in this book. So this was really where the trajectory that was going more and more in the direction of what they call high modernism, or this really trying to push for more industrial type development in the Amazon, ran into, because of politics, because of the changing politics in Brazil, and because of the rising critique, the impacts that could be seen already in deforestation and so forth, kind of stopped, didn't stop, but was challenged at this point. And really began to develop then other kinds of policies. So there were specific individuals. One of them is Maria Alegretti, is an anthropologist who worked in Acre with the rubber tappers. She was doing her master's research, met Chico Mendes, and she began to work with him. And she ended up being in a policy-making position as Secretary for Coordination of the Amazon in the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil. And so she was able to help them develop the proposal for extractive reserves. Extractive reserves were a really important policy because until then, for small farmers or small producers of any kind, the only way to get access to land to public land, was through these colonization programs. You could be a small farmer in a colonization program and you would get an allotment of 100 hectares, which is a lot of land. But it's not enough if you're a rubber tapper, because as I mentioned, the rubber trees have to be dispersed. It takes 300 to 500 hectares of forest for enough rubber trees to support a rubber tapper family. And so they didn't want to divide it up into smaller parcels. They wanted to keep the large areas that they occupied as communities. But there was no way to do that legally. So they took as their model indigenous reserves, which are collective territories. They're not divided up individually. And that's what they proposed. They proposed the creation of extractive reserves. They don't own the land, but they have rights to stay on it for 20 years, I think, as long as they continue to maintain the resource base. Brand new idea. And this was the origin of what's now used throughout the world, this idea of sustainable use reserves, protected areas that could include people within certain parameters. So this was a huge thing. It became part of the international understanding of different categories of protected areas, this idea of sustainable use areas. and the extractive reserves were the first. The rubber tappers created their own council, which now is called the Extractivists. Council of Extractivists became an important player in policy decision making. They're still sitting on various councils and having their voice heard. They were also able, this was during around the period of the Rio conference, Rio 92 conference. So there you have a lot of international pressure to reduce deforestation in the Amazon. Why? Because of impacts in the rest of the world and this concern about the Amazon forest and its role in global climate. So that began in 1988-89. There was a big drought here in the US, and people over here got really concerned about what was happening in the Amazon because of that. So one of the outcomes of the Rio 92 conference was the creation of this pilot program for the Amazon, which was funded by 7 countries. I'm not sure I can name them, but Germany, US, Norway, a bunch of other ones. And they invested large sums of money in things like the extractive reserves, other pilot projects, sustainability. They invested in local municipal governance. They invested in sustainable logging, fishing, community rules for fishing. A lot of pilot programs were funded under this big program. So everything came together at this period. And in Acre, we'll hear more later, there was a very charismatic governor, Jorge Viana, who called himself the forest governor, and the whole state then became an experiment in forest-based development, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. And Marina Silva, who was one of Chico Mendes' allies and a former rubber tapper herself, became environment minister during this period. And she's now running for president for the 3rd time. Maybe she'll win this time. So a lot of things came together during this period and really shifted the balance of power. One of the things that happened as a result was a big reduction in deforestation in Brazil, a really remarkable decline in deforestation. But unfortunately, it's not continued. It's now inching back up. And so now what's happened is we seem to be rolling back toward the old paradigm. I would say that the old paradigm never ended, but there were new players and new voices and new policies that came along with it. But they have not been able to keep control of power. And so, and this is not something just in Brazil. You sort of see this happening in many parts of the world, including our own country. So a lot of the, 60s, 70s, 80s was a period of social policy and social inclusion and all those kinds of ideas that were relatively new. And now you see kind of a backlash against that. So part of this is the new proposals for dams and roads. We're going to have a whole session on dams, and already heard a bit about dams. The Belo Monte Dam was stopped in 1989. We heard about that from Mike Hegenberger. I have shown pictures. I know we talked about the Kayapo woman who put her knife or machete up against an engineer's face and said, your mother didn't hold you. But they were able to muster, and Sting was there. They had a big manifestation, 1989. They stopped that dam. It was being funded by the World Bank, and the World Bank backed off. but it's now being built. It's almost completely built. I'm not sure exactly. Bella Monchi, we heard about that, and we saw ourselves pictures. So these things are being reversed. There was also an important revision of the Forest Code, which regulates how much forest has to be maintained on private properties, and those rules were significantly loosened up. And in fact, any deforestation prior to 2009 has now been forgiven. So that was interesting. Amnesty for our deforesters. The violence has continued. There are still people being murdered in Brazil, environmentalists being murdered in Brazil at a higher rate than other countries. And the Congress is trying to roll back a lot of the environmental regulation. They're trying to reduce the size of protected areas. Annalisa was just talking about that. They're trying to change the rules for how indigenous lands are demarcated. They would like to be in charge of that, Congress be in charge of that. So you can imagine what that would lead to. So for me, it's very interesting, having started out in the 70s when literally people talked about cattle being the vocation of the Amazon. There was no, there was very little understanding of the complexity of it, of the people who already lived there, what the environmental limits might be, and the indigenous knowledge that was there. The whole thinking was bring in outsiders to occupy this empty area that's occupied by people who don't know how to use it. And then there was this huge response to that, and a big pushback and very important policy changes based on social mobilization. So it wasn't just enlightened policymakers, it was resistance and political pressure during a period of democratization. Now what we have in Brazil is what many would call a post-coup situation, and a Congress that's very much dominated by those agribusiness interests, who really, there's very little check on this. Oh yeah, so just to give you some visuals to go along with this. Well, anyway, so this is a website. If you want to go there, this is a really interesting website of geo-referenced socio-environmental information in the Amazon. It's interactive, covers all the countries, and you can look at maps of a lot of these things we're talking about. So for example, here's a map of highways. This is based on putting together IRSA, the big regional plans, as well as country level plans. There are almost 1 million kilometers of highways, and about 65% of them are still unpaved. So there's a big difference between a paved road and an unpaved road in terms of their environmental impact. And also in terms of their, how useful they are for local people. Roads are a tricky issue because local people really welcome having roads. It means that they can get to a health post, that they can get, they're not so isolated, and they can, things can come into them, also products and so forth. So roads are welcome, but they also bring with them very clear and negative impacts. And some of the roads are planned through really core areas. And Ecuador has a lot of roads due to oil exploration. So this is where national differences become important. There isn't much oil in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon. Right over the border in Peru and Ecuador, there's a lot of oil. So those dynamics are very different. And here we have oil and gas. you can see these pink blocks are lotes, oil concessions that have either been requested or are functioning already. The dark purple are already functioning. Yes, it's pretty much all of Peru.
Excuse me, Dr.
Yeah.
Schmink. This area in the middle of the Amazon state,
This one.
it's
What is this? Bloody.
bloody.
Yes?
It's gas.
And petroleum. So they have, but they only have the oil and gas. They have gas.
So this is they're exploring still, according to this. This is a couple of years old. So that could have evolved into
Yeah,
something.
but I think this is not this specific concession. They have a lot of gas, but they have Petrobras have that they drill. I think petroleum oil, but I think it's not all this area.
This is an
Huge
area they're
yeah.
exploring,
Yeah.
and
yeah.
then they'll be smaller
Because
when they're starting to.
Other enterprise, a guy hit the HRT. They have explored a lot of those areas, but they only found gas, so they didn't have interest to still in the area. So they get back to other areas on the Africa and here, and I don't know where.
What's that?
In all of the Amazon regions.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing.
There's one in the middle of the Yosemite National Park.
Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap of these oil concessions with indigenous territories. But most countries in South America control the subsoil rights. They maintain control over things that are underground. This means that even though indigenous groups have territories that are theirs, they don't necessarily control what's underneath them. And that applies to mining and oil and gas.
Or the forest. If they want to, in the case of Peru, if they want to manage the forest in a large scale, they have to have a special permission.
Right, so there are a lot of restrictions even on other things that they can. So this creates, and that's where it gets into to what extent informed consent is being used with indigenous groups for them to understand and give consent to development on their lands. And you can probably imagine that in many cases it's not being done. Even though that there is a precedent for this from the United Nations, there are protocols. It's often done in a very perfunctory way. And so these are big threats. Mining is much more important in Brazil, as you can see. So they're mostly over here. This is the area that I worked in. A lot of gold, the Tapajós. Mostly over here in the eastern Amazon. And we're not really going to talk about gold mining, particularly this semester, although I did visit a lot of gold mining areas back in the 70s and 80s, and it really fluctuates depending on the price of gold. So if the price of gold goes way up, all these areas open up and people start digging placer mines in the beds of the rivers, diverting the rivers, and yeah.
I think mining is still very important. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
They are very associated with the dams and the energy that they are producing. I think they are talking about, but you have and had a costa press.
Yes.
It discusses about that.
Uh-huh.
You need to pay attention to that because they are.
Yeah, yeah, and so there's small-scale mining, which is what I'm familiar with, beds of the rivers, and there's industrial mining, which is often very closely connected with the projects for hydroelectric power and highways, so that they can service the mining companies.
And in this case, I think that was the place because we have a Belo Sun, which has huge mining that is in this area.
Yeah,
Very
that's what
close to-
Marcelo mentioned. And I just saw today that they were, there's a federal stoppage of the Belo Sun project until they regularize their licenses, whatever that means, or however long.
Project, huge.
And here are the dams. So you can, all these little triangles, those are all planned or operating or in development dams. So many of them, hundreds of dams. And some of them are cross-border dams. So there are impacts across the border between Brazil and Bolivia. And here's the Payapó. And as you can see, Pare de Belo Monte, that's in Rio. And this is just a map of where the Belo Monte is. Notice the time. So I'm going to sum up by saying that right now, since the end of the 90s, more or less, it's really not clear what direction things are going. We call that indeterminacy. There are conflicting and parallel policies, this sort of what she called the techno-industrial versus socio-environmental approaches. There are regional and local dynamics that are different from national level. Some states are doing things differently. There are differences between countries. In Brazil, there's been this kind of restart of the big federal development planning projects and also this regional planning process called IRSA, which is looking at connecting all the countries in the Amazon roads and waterways. And a lot of this also involved with new ways of appropriating land by taking control of the decision-making over the land, even if you don't. So there is some criticism of international influences that have sort of a conservation, in fact, or other ways of setting aside land can be seen as veiled coercion. So another way of imposing outsiders' control over land without actually taking the land. So these are really big debates right now, and not very positive at the moment. But after you all get done, I'm sure we'll be much better.